And I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce and welcome our social studies team. So you will hear from Megan, Elizabeth, and Zale a little bit about themselves and our social studies program in grades 6 through 8. So I will pass the baton to you three. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. My name is Megan Watson, and I am the 6th grade humanities teacher. It's only my second year at Catlin, and I'm really happy to be at Catlin because it's allowing me the opportunity to return to what I consider my first love, which is teaching social studies. I'm coming to Catlin having been with Portland Public School District for about 5 years. And I've primarily served in this role as a student success advocate, mentor, and tutor. And that's been both at the high school and middle school level. And so I've been really immersed in multiple subjects and supporting students academically, socially, emotionally. And so I went to school to study history. That was my first 2 years in the classroom, was ninth grade and 11th grade history, US and world history. And so I'm just happy to be at Catlin teaching history and trying it out with 11-year-olds, which surprisingly enough has been such a joy. And I get to look at this subject area with totally different eyes by working with them. So happy to be here.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Ryan, and I started at Catlin last year. Prior to that, I worked at the Archer School for Girls in Los Angeles, and prior to that, I taught for about 8 years in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. And so I trained to become a teacher in Australia. I learned all of my skills and strategies and perspectives in the Australian school system. As a history teacher, I have loved moving from the upper school to the middle school, a little bit like Megan. It has been a true joy to take a lot of high level upper school history learning and to really work with middle school students to empower them to become owners of their own learning, and to really look at skills of thinking critically and working towards deep understanding of history, even within the middle school. I currently teach 7th grade world history, which I absolutely love. The subject is called Land, Power and Conquest. And so we explore those themes throughout the year. We really use those ideas and concepts to look at a number of different civilizations. And officially we begin about the year 1000 CE, and we chart the land, power and conquest and experiences of civilizations around the globe into the contemporary era. So it's been a lot of fun, and yeah, like Megan, I'm also really glad to be here and loving teaching middle school students as well.
Hey everybody, my name is Zale Clay. I'm the 8th grade history teacher, and this is also my second year at Catlin. I've been a history teacher in Oregon for 8 years now, and previously taught in the public school setting and in charter schools. Originally from Arlington, Virginia, and got educated out in Chicago, and my background is in intellectual history and political theory. And these are concepts that we revisit in the 8th grade, particularly looking at a kind of introduction to political theory and American history as a 400-year history of civil rights. And I'll talk a little bit more later about the kind of melding of those two different domains and why it's so much fun to be immersed with a group of students who are curious and kind and dynamic and routinely hilarious. So I'll talk a little bit more about my class as we progress.
Okay, so I'm about to share my screen, and I think Megan will walk us through our middle school department aims for social studies. So let me just make sure that this is all working. Here we go, hopefully this works.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay, it's over here.
So before I launch into what the department aims are, Zale, Elizabeth, and I are all re-envisioning what the aims of what the middle school history curriculum could look like. And so we have been working with how do we want to approach this as second year teachers, first year at Catlin, being new to the school. And so if you find our aim a bit wordy, we are still working and crafting this. And so I'm going to walk you through it just for a little bit. So in bold, and I'm glad that Elizabeth bold put these in bold type, at the heart of the aim of the history curriculum is teaching students how to research critically. And that is by like accessing accurate information. As Jesse had pointed out at the tail end of the science crew, Elizabeth is working on a unit involving, I think he said, like identifying fake news. And we're finding that to be so relevant, especially in 2020 and 2019. Accessing this accurate information and being able to support your own claims with credible sources is really at the heart of this. So we're trying to build curriculum that strengthens the skills of students writing, whether it's exploratory, whether it's academic based or opinion based. We're also trying to get them, while they're doing this, to engage with and evaluate diverse sources of information. And while doing that, trying to introduce them into the practice of trying to understand and check their own bias. And that's something that my students right now are currently working on is, yes, we can evaluate sources, we can look at primary and secondary sources, but what role does our own bias, as well as maybe the author's bias, play in this? We're also wanting them to individually and collaboratively articulate their learning process and knowledge. And in that little yellow part, we put up that sometimes this is teacher directed and sometimes this is a self-selected path. So being able to be innovative in how they share their learning is also really important for middle school history. We're also adding to the history curriculum projects and opportunities for students to exercise their empathy and widen their circles of concern, especially because all three of us teach such different subject areas within history, myself being humanities, so like ancient history, Elizabeth picking up towards the end of like the early 1900s and on, and Zale, you're kind of focusing on US history and government and right. So there's a lot of opportunities for students in the middle school to be working with different subject areas or topics and concerns. And so we're hoping that when they're doing this, that they're also being able to reflect on the values that Catlin Gable is putting forth as what the middle school stands for. And so our final one is manifesting our avowed values into informed, culturally responsive action within both their local and global communities, which typically and naturally comes from any process which allows them to exercise empathy and widen their circle of concern. We've found that students are looking for ways to take that to a local action or within global communities. Do you think that I covered that all okay? Zale, Elizabeth, anything you'd want to add?
No, I think that was brilliant.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Megan.
Yeah.
Are you all happy for me to go into my sample lesson, or would we like to go in the order of 6, 7, 8?
You can go first, Elizabeth, I don't mind.
Okay, so we're a little out of order in terms of the chronology of our grades, but I'm going to share with you now a sample that hopefully brings to life some of the goals and aims that we have as a department. And this is really to give you a taste test of what a history lesson could look like for a 7th grade student. And so I'll walk you through these slides, and mainly what I'm trying to share with you here is, again, samples of activities and thinking routines that we use in the history department. Typically, I always try to bring students to really broad, important thinking points like this one here, the quote that history isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. And I think you can see across each of our grade levels, we're really urging students to dig deeper and to practice the skills of analysis, not just of content, but of where that content comes from. So this is a sample of a lesson about the migrant experience, which is a topic that we explore in 7th grade history. And typically we would begin a lesson with our very big questions. These tend to be philosophical. They tend to push students towards the big learning themes of the subject. So here we have, how can we as historians empathise with the universal experience of migration? And this is a good sample of how we might begin a unit to really try and get students thinking about perspective and to capture their imagination and their empathy as well. Of course, with middle schoolers, it's important to drill down into the concrete elements of a lesson. So I always try to give a sense of the clear agenda. What is the end point of this lesson? And you'll see here that these would be the 3 bullet points for this very rapidly sped up lesson. So in my sample today, to unpack the migrant experience, I'm sharing with you a source that comes from an Australian artist called Shaun Tan. He himself experienced migration from Vietnam to Australia. And typically we all try to use sources like this to capture student attention and again, bring them into the historical issue. And you can see a breakdown here of how we would explore this topic. Where possible, I always try to provide students with contextual information about an author or a creator. And I just thought this was a really powerful quote to give you a sense of some of the key themes that we talk about. And I like the idea here that fundamental things for a migrant, such as language, transportation, food, housing, and work, are strange and often surreal. So we're even here talking about the broader experience of otherness that so many people experience within US society. So this is a little taste test of this beautiful picture storybook. It's just a couple of key images. In a lesson, students would have the opportunity to really engage with these types of images, to learn to access some of the experiences of migration. So I'm going to just quickly walk you through and show you what I consider to be some pretty beautiful images. And for middle school students, this, they could spend an entire lesson just unpacking one of these pages. Their imagination and their creativity is so ripe for this kind of activity. I'm moving very quickly. We would spend a lot longer on each of these images. Okay. So after students have had the opportunity in a lesson to be exposed to a historical source or a source like this, we would typically then move into some thinking routines. And I really like something like this, See, Think, Wonder, just providing students with concrete ways to actually unpack what they've experienced and to allow them to go a little deeper into their inferences and interpretation, and then to broaden out to ask more questions about the historical source as well. Something that is really important in 7th grade history is also learning the skills of conversation. So rather than just letting students go wild with conversation on their own, providing structures that allows them to learn about not only sharing, but listening. And so a routine like Save the Last Word is a really powerful way to break conversation down and to teach students about how we can share observation and actually engage with one another's ideas and processes. And then to finish up a lesson, I think it's always something that we try to emphasize in social studies and history is that we want to return to the big questions. So allowing students the opportunity to share what they're still wondering about, connect back to the big objective or the big goal of the lesson, as you can see here with question 2. And then in middle school, I think providing students with the opportunity to bring personal connection into the course and into the subject matter is a really powerful part of what we try to build into our lessons. And that's it from me. I'll move on to the next slide.
Zale, would you like to go next?
I could. I do have to share my own screen. So if there's something on this slideshow that you'd like to use.
Okay, sure. Then I just have one slide on my lesson and then you can, Elizabeth, do you care to be my DJ?
Oh, sure. So Megan, just let me know when you want me to click through to the next one.
Great, thank you. By the way, Elizabeth, those pictures were really cool. I would love to talk to you about that lesson plan sometime. So 6th grade, we always have these essential questions. And I want to just pause for a moment to be like, one of the things that I love doing with 6th grade that kind of falls in line with the progressive education that Catlin strives to accomplish is teaching the whole child. And I feel like 11 to 12-year-olds, and I'm sure this is probably true for 7th and 8th grade, is this teaching the whole child aspect. So really inviting them into the classroom. And that's one of my favorite pillars of progressive ed. And it probably speaks to my many years of serving as a mentor and a student success advocate, is learning firsthand that not much learning takes place unless students see themselves reflected or invited into the content, especially when you're 11 and 12 years old. So a unit that we're looking at right now, and I always start the school year off with, was, first of all, you're in a history class, but how do we even build understanding of the past? And so I try to design learning opportunities that honor and invite student identities. And I'm going to give you a little example of one that we worked on last week that I feel attempts to achieve that. So I always, like Elizabeth was pointing out, I try to tell them what they're learning and why. And so what they've been learning is how to build understanding of the past through primary sources. And the big why for this is it kind of hits back to what those departmental aims are. Understanding where their information comes from strengthens their ability to build evidence-based understanding and to be able to support their opinions and claims with credible sources. So in class, I front load information in a discussion about what documents are. And on a different class day, we talk about oral histories. We also talk about photographs, and we talk about objects. There are many types of primary source documents, but to try to help them feel like an expert with a primary source document, I start with these four for sixth grade. And so I've given you examples of what a homework assignment for each of these front-loaded class time would look like, and then what the follow-up class would look like. So for example, they might arrive to class and we're talking about documents. And then the homework, which is usually always an extension of what they learned that day, would be to locate and bring to class a primary source document from their own home. So this is my attempt to invite them into the content and the curriculum. So they're learning about documents, and they might not realize, oh, I have a ton of primary source documents laying around my own house. And then the follow-up to that would be a small group share out of student documents. So they get into little breakout rooms and everyone takes turns talking about their document. And then the essential question being like, what do these documents teach us about each other? And the same thing goes with oral histories and photographs. There are examples of the homework that they did. So for oral histories, once they got a bit of background knowledge about it, they uploaded a Flipgrid video sharing a story passed on to them from a family member or community member. That ended up being really fun because they ended up having some pretty funny conversations, and the stories that they uploaded were pretty comical at times. And so the follow-up to that homework was to have a small group story time. And then when they learned about photographs for homework that night, to extend that learning was to analyze a photograph using some investigative questions. And then they came back to class to have a discussion about that photograph. I picked a photograph that was relevant to them during that week, and it was a photo of the first presidential debate that was ever televised, because a lot of them were really heated about the first presidential debate they saw this year. And so I chose that photograph because it felt relevant, and the conversation we had about what was a televised debate like then compared to what we saw a couple weeks ago. And then last, with the objects, once again, trying to invite them into their learning by asking them to locate an object that was older than them and is still considered useful today. And they uploaded Flipgrid videos, answering a following list of questions about their object. And then the follow-up to that, to kind of close out that little mini unit, was for them to get into small groups. They were given a new primary source and they did a little object analysis. So this is just one example of one way that I tried to invite students and their identities into their learning.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share and hand over to Dale.
That looked really fascinating, Megan.
Thanks.
So I think I'm going to share a little bit of an overarching trajectory for the class and then zero in on some of the projects that we've been working on lately. So we in the 8th grade are leaning hard into civic education and the election, which is at the forefront of most of my students' minds anyway, and presents a very easy teachable moment for a 8th grade history teacher. So we began the year in exercises of speech and debate, and we particularly looked at the world of logical fallacies, at demagoguery, and on why these rhetorical devices are so effective while also being so specious. And so in addition to students, learning, familiarizing themselves with these terms and learning to spot them, we actually held a mock election. And my thinking was that students, in order to learn not to be convinced by logical fallacies, would learn to deliberately and intentionally employ them to great comic effect against one another. And this actually turned into a presidential debate bingo competition that I'll turn to now, where students created their own bingo cards incorporating different political topics as well as logical fallacies that we'd studied together, and competed against one another in viewing the first presidential debate. And I'm not sure that there were any clear winners, but this was a pretty effective way for students to kind of think critically through what the candidates themselves were saying, as well as to sort of live fact check the event. If I can just return, so we're going to be studying US government, and we're in the midst of a study of the Electoral College, of the history of voting suppression around elections, and of gerrymandering. And we in the 8th grade are having a pretty intense competition where students have been studying the Electoral College and learning how political polls work and competing with one another to predict the outcome of November 3rd's presidential election, of which there will be big prizes. I think in history in the 8th grade, we do a lot of reading and analyzing primary, secondary sources together. There's a fair amount of oral argument and debate. There's lots of role-playing games, exercises, and activities. There's a fair amount of writing, both expository as well as essay composition, and especially in the kind of pivot to remote ed and Zoom classes, lots of independent, student-centered research projects and presentations. And those can take on all kinds of different forms, as we've been learning to utilize this medium. In the upper left-hand corner, this was an example of a graphic novel a student had composed last spring, and it was based on the use of the Warsaw Zoo as a refugee center throughout the Second World War. And in the bottom right corner, this was a digital scavenger hunt at the British Museum in London. And I think I'm going to stop share there. Okay.
That bingo card.
Thanks,
was
you.
really good.
Yeah, they got a little bit too into it, but it was pretty exciting.
Elizabeth,
Malarkey.
yeah, Elizabeth and I were talking about how the middle school, they're really competitive. Like when you introduce any type of activity that allows for them to get really into it, they really go for it.
Yeah, although one thing I kind of want to reiterate is that I feel like because they all know each other and will see each other the next day, they're capable of a level of civility and discourse that other people maybe aren't so much. So I feel like there is a lot of consensus building, even when they're having heated debates with one another.
Nice.
I've just spotted a question that is in the chat. Do you teach about history and societies from other parts of the world? Yes, indeed, we really do. And there's a reference there to communist and socialist. That is certainly a part of all of our curriculum. Zale, as you can see, is really drilling into the US history component, but still with a very strong philosophical leaning to different theories and different thought processes around the world. 7th grade world history is definitely predominantly about other parts of the world. And we tip into the US around the 20th century, but we are really reaching out to explore not only other parts of the world, but a lot of Indigenous histories around the world as well. So to answer that question, yes.
I'm curious if any of you can share in a non-pandemic world, if there are opportunities for your students to get off campus, either for like a day, like a field trip or something like that.
That is a good question because we're all new to Catlin and we got met with the transition to remote learning in our first year. So I think that we all, especially with like experiential weeks, that would have been our first time to really take students off campus. But I see that in the future happening for sure, especially once we have some more time at Catlin under our belt. I can't speak for you two, but I'm sure that would happen.
There was a field trip to the Oregon Holocaust Memorial that we sort of transitioned away from, and this would have occurred, I think, last April, and we ended up being able to bring the relative of a survivor in to speak with our students, and that was kind of during our covering of that unit together in the spring.
Mhm.
See
Thank-
another question from Ted Jen. How do you help students have conversations where there are big differences in opinions? And that is a big part of what I think we're all working collaboratively on at the moment. In 7th grade, we do use a lot of conversation protocols. And I know that Megan shared with me some really awesome sentence starters just to provide students with frameworks about how to have healthy disagreement. So I think really giving structure to conversation, particularly when there's big differences in opinion, is a big part of what we do.
Yeah, setting them up for success is a big part for the middle school age. Is like, how do you approach someone who's maybe saying something that you would love to know what evidence they have to support that? What's a respectful way that's not cutting them off, but engaging them and asking them to explain further? So definitely a lot of practice.
Yeah, and I think in classroom discussions, students really aren't concerned about like winning the argument or scoring points or kind of like dunking on each other, but really are interested in sharing their own personal experiences and understanding where others are coming from. And that's a kind of type of style of discourse that I think teachers at Catlin are pretty adept at encouraging.
There's another question in the chat. What is your favorite thing about teaching at Catlin Gale?
For me, it is a sense that creativity is encouraged, not just from students, but from teachers. And I feel like I've been able to experiment with some of my most creative projects and lessons, and certainly to reflect on those and to keep improving them. But I have really enjoyed the trust that the school has in teachers and the space that we're given to explore our expertise.
I would add also the students. I think the students are really fun and genuinely curious. And I think when I get to sort of re-engage with these subjects that I'm passionate about, and then to kind of see the magic that happens when students engage with them in their own way and sort of follow up their own interests, it's a kind of, yeah, it's that kind of alchemy of the classroom. So it's really fun.
And I would add to what Elizabeth was saying, we're encouraged and trusted a lot. And in that, if we're fumbling with a unit or are needing support in that, there's a lot of support systems like the instructional coaches and ongoing training that happens throughout the year that I feel like pops up right when I'm starting to think, oh, I really would love to explore this or that. It's like, oh, in 2 weeks, here's this optional opt-in training on like how to use new online technology, or are you struggling with giving students feedback? Come to this little workshop and we'll talk about different forms of feedback. And so that's one of my favorite things about teaching at Catlin is that that I can come forward with my areas of growth and feel supported with it.
Nice, thank you.
All right, it is 8:30, so we close the social studies section. Thank you to Megan, Elizabeth, and Zale
Yeah.
For the overview and sharing what you do in your classrooms and all the great stuff that's happening there.